I wanted to bring up a topic here of why now is a really great time to talk about broken homes. This came to me from a little bit of Bible reading I was doing recently, but that's not the topic I want to hop into. It's just what sparked my thought. There was a part in the scriptures talking about the importance of family and things like that. So I started to relate that to what I see in our society nowadays. And one of the unfortunate things that we all have experienced, whether personally or we know people who have been through this, is children that come from a broken home. It's a little bit of a personal thing for me. I was so fortunate as a child to come from, I guess, what I would call an almost broken home. And what I mean by that is when I was about 2 or 3 years old, before I really was aware much of what was going on around me, my mom and dad got divorced. But my mom got remarried when I was still young. And my who the world would call my stepdad, who I would call my dad, because he's the one that raised me, accepted me as his own. And so, although I had the dynamic of my birth father, I never lived in a household where it was just my mom. I never lived in a single parent household. But the amazing thing for me is that when I look back on my life and some of the choices that I made, not living with my original dad and mom caused a lot of pain inside of me. Even though my stepdad is my dad, and I've learned so much from him, and I had such a healthy upbringing. There was still that dynamic, of course, right? That there's this other person out here who is my father, but he's not here. And I remember being a very young child, probably from the ages that I can remember still to this day, probably from the age of 5 or so, to probably up until I was I can remember maybe 11 or 12. I had a lot of challenges with the situation. And I think it's something that I haven't really thought about in a lot of years. But as I was reflecting on talking to you about this and some of the dangers I see in our society with all these broken homes, I started to think back on my own life, and I realized, wow, it really did affect the way I look at life, the way I look at relationships. I'll get into some of that in a moment. But I was really fortunate because while I know there's a lot of kids that grew up in a single family home, in fact, when I was growing up in the 80s, that's where that term latchkey kid came into effect. I would say a good 60, 70, 80% of my friends were latchkey kids. I remember very specifically my friend Sean, who I was just really good friends with back, when I was in junior high school, getting into high school. Well, from elementary school into high school. He lived with his mom. And I can't tell you how many times we would go home. He and I would leave school, and sometimes we would go over to his house. His mom wasn't home yet from work, so it was just him. And I saw a lot of pain in my friend Sean. And looking back on it now, I realize, and I think I kind of sensed even back then as a young teenager, that it was from the fact that he didn't have any parents around. He didn't have any support. I think about another friend of mine back when I was probably 5. Memory sticks out in my mind vividly. His name was Dennis. And I was over at his house one evening time. And we were just out playing. And we lived in a small town. My mom had this bell that she would ring when it was dinner time. And so my brother and I, if we were down the street at a friend's house, we'd hear the bell and know it was time to come home. The bell hadn't rung yet. And I was over at Dennis's house. And he lived with just his mom. And all I remember about her was that she was not a very happy person. I remember kind of being afraid of her as a 5-year-old kid. She was very caustic, always yelling at Dennis and me if I was over there. And I remember we were sitting out in the front of his house, kind of near the street, just kind of I forget what we were doing, maybe playing with our little race cars or something on the street, And his mom yells out the door to him, "Dennis, get over here." And he goes up to the door, and she kind of like forces a plate of spaghetti on him. Says, "Eat this. Here's your dinner." My friend Dennis is out on his front stoop eating his dinner with no parent. Just his friend Matt sitting there going like, "What's going on? He's eating dinner right now?" And then that's where the memory kind of fades. But probably I heard the bell and I went home for my dinner. But these are things I saw growing up of my friends living in broken homes. And when my brother and I, when we were young and had friends, most of our friends would want to come to our house, especially if they came from these broken homes. Like Sean, for example, was at my house a lot. And I realized after a while, he's here because there's two parents here, and it was a very loving environment. My parents were so loving on my brother and I, and we were so fortunate to live like that. When so many kids then up to now have not had that experience. And so I want to go back, though, to something I briefly mentioned earlier, and that is, even though I lived in that environment and I had two loving parents to raise me and my brother, I still had a lot of pain. I remember from like around 5 to 12 or so, dealing with my birth dad. And I remember being on the phone with him sometimes, when he would call. And it wasn't very frequent that we would talk. And I forget what we would talk about. I was just a kid. But I remember vividly, many times, getting off the phone. And I don't know why, but I would just sit there and cry as a young little kid, just feeling so sad. And I can't remember now why I was sad specifically. I think it was just, that's my dad, and I don't have a lot of chance to talk to him. I don't know how to process that right now, but I just remember having these really sad thoughts, these sad feelings, and just crying as a kid, after I would talk to him. I remember very vividly the day when my stepdad officially adopted me with his name. And I remember sitting in the car with my birth dad after the court thing was over and it was official. I remember him bawling his eyes out. But that's neither near nor there, just a memory. But my point is this: there's so many kids that have grown up with just one parent. And as I started to think more about this and the things that it infects our society with, is so much negative stuff. And I guess what I want to say here is I want to encourage anyone right now who's watching this and you're a parent with kids and you're having issues in your marriage and you're having thoughts of divorce and leaving. I just want to caution you, because once you have kids, those are the most important, precious things you'll ever have, right? That's what every parent thinks and feels. And I know, look, we've all had issues in our marriages. And sometimes it's tough to continue going on, right? But if you have kids involved, young kids, right? I would just ask you to think about how much harder can you work to mend your relationship with your spouse for the benefit of your children. I wrote down some things here I just want to talk to you about the effects that divorce has on a child. Emotional stunting. If you have to go forward with that divorce, it's going to emotional stunt your child no matter how you try to help them work through it. It's going to happen. They're going to live their lives with feelings of insecurity, and they're not going to know why. They're going to have feelings of guilt and shame, and they're not going to know why. I lived in a two-parent home, like I told you, very loving. Now that I'm saying this to you, I think part of that crying was a feeling as a little child, 5 or 6, 7 years old. I had feelings of guilt and shame, and I didn't know why. Trust issues. Oh, that was a big one for me. That was a big one for me. And again, I'm not even the product of a true divorced one-parent household. Imagine what the children that go through that. And I know people to this day that went through it. I have people very close to me where their parents got divorced to this day. And I see the insecurity in them. And they're now in their 50s like me. And I know what it's traced back to. The trust issues. There was a time in my life when I was 15 up to probably 25 where if anybody who would listen to me, I'd say, I'm never getting married. Isn't that funny? I grew up in a 2-parent home with 2 loving parents who loved me. I never had any issues of not feeling wanted, because that's part of what kids go through when it's a divorced household. Never had any of that. I always knew I was wanted. I always felt loved. But at some point, something in my mind said, I'm never getting married. Eventually I did, and married to an amazing woman. But yeah, trust issues, behavior stuff. You know, divorce can turn a child either into a bully because they don't know how to deal with the pain and the frustration and the anger they're feeling, so they take it out on other kids and bully kids, or they can go the other way and become very shy. I went that way. I was very shy for most of my young adulthood. A lot of kids that go through a divorce drop out of high school early. So they never go to college. There are statistics out there, you can look them up, that a lot of these kids end up having economic issues their entire lives. They don't have the best jobs. They don't get themselves into the best opportunities. And a lot of this has been rooted back to problems in the home. Problems with the fact that their parents weren't there. The one parent was there, but the one parent's working. It's not the same as having 2 parents there. Anxiety, depression, huge in children that are the product of divorce. A lot of these kids end up going, because of the relationship challenges and trust issues, end up going from sexual partner to sexual partner to sexual partner. A lot of them end up with some kind of disease because of that. These are the ramifications of us as adults not being able to fix our relationships with our spouse. It's a serious issue. It infects so much of society with so much negative stuff. Those are the main points I think I wanted to make. I wrote down some other things, but I think you get my point. Again, I'm not here to tell anybody what to do. Your life is your life. I'm just bringing out some points that if you are a parent right now, going through some challenges in the relationship, just think about your kids and ask yourself, have we explored every opportunity here together, you and your spouse? Have we explored everything we can possibly do to overcome our challenges together, understand one another better? You know, heck, there's a lot of things that cause divorce. Some of them are pretty major, and some of them can be fixed. So just think about your kids. Think about what they're going to go through if mom or dad leaves. It's a big deal. Like I said, I was not a product. I have said this many times already on this video, but I just want to make that point. I was not a product of that. I had a loving home, but I wasn't with my 2 original parents. And as a little kid, there's a lot there I didn't understand, right? And it caused issues with me, even with the love, even with the support I had from 2 parents who just loved me. I had a lot of relationship issues that I had to get over as a younger adult in my 20s. finally face and figure out that's why I don't trust. That's why. And yet I grew up with trusting parents. Imagine what these kids who the entire marriage relationship is just severed in front of them, what they're going through, the emotions they go through, and the trust issues they have, and the economic problems and relationship problems and physical and that can come from disease and things like that in their future. Just think about it. Don't really have a great ending for this video, so I guess I'll leave it at that and just give you something to think about.